Okay, so any of you have heard me talking about the last big chunk of money that that went out into the grid industry from the federal government will hear me talking about one of my favorite projects, which was the Smart Grid Investment Grant money that went to EPB in Chattanooga to upgrade their entire system and really make it drive smart grid. And in doing so, they installed an advanced communication network with excess broadband capacity and then offered every single one of their customers broadband. They started as a goal of 1 gigabyte economy, and now are, I think, at 10 gigabytes, so high speed broadband that has driven an economic revival of Chattanooga, which is astounding. And a recent study looked back at the impact of that investment and found that it resulted in something on the order of $8 to $9 billion of economic development. And I love that story because it isn't just about a smart grid investment grants. We're very excited about those, but it's about the impact and this convergence of the electricity network with the communication network. And we're seeing convergence with transportation, of course, and with other lifeline networks. But I think this convergence with the communication networks is one of the most exciting things that's happening to our industry today. And so that's what we wanted to talk about today with Gil Quiñones, who is the chair of our board and the head of ComEd it's been a year.
1 year.
1 year.
Time flies.
And with Chris Gutman-McCabe, who is sitting in for Rob Schwartz, who had a family emergency from Anterix. So I wanted to just jump right in, because I don't think you need introductions, and talk to you, Gil, about what this convergence of electricity and telecom networks means to the utility industry.
Well, it's really a fascinating functionality or trend that's happening in the electric industry. You know, you've heard maybe in some of my previous events where I spoke that this one-way power system, generation, transmission, distribution to load, one-way power flow is really starting to get converted or evolving towards a multi-flow power system. And at ComEd, we're seeing that in Chicago and Northern Illinois. And there are a lot more intelligent devices that are installed in grids nowadays, aside from integrating renewables, wind, solar. There are a lot of smart switches, voltage optimization devices, and other systems that are on the grid. Plus, our customers are having more intelligent building mechanical and electrical systems as well. So how do you orchestrate, that can only happen with the convergence between telecom and the power grid. And so I like to explain it that we really need a new operating system and a new set of application software to operate the grid, and that's starting to happen now. But we need enabling technologies like what Chris would be talking about.
Perfect.
Yes.
Yeah.
You're right.
I set you up there.
That's a
like a handoff.
Let me just take a
handoff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you, Gil and Karen. And thank you. Super excited to be here. I was here last year, and at that point in time was excited to be in 3-4 dimensions, right? Somebody recently said seeing people in a Z-axis for the first time in a while was super exciting.
Learning how tall and short people are.
Yeah, exactly. And Karen and I did a panel a week ago that went virtual again. And it was weird to have a few that were in person and then to go back virtual and just see someone and not see the audience. So I want to say thank you for the team, Richie, and everybody for putting this together. Gil gave me a softball. I mean, we're Anterix, we're a wireless broadband company. At our core, we believe a smart grid needs smart communications. And you heard, Gil use words like intelligent and smart and edge and evolution. What we're seeing is an absolute necessity for broadband by utilities. They are, there's a new, maybe we call them realities, Gil, that you and other leaders are facing. The electrification of different sectors within your footprint, right? Put that on top of concerns about cybersecurity. We've got resiliency issues, Obviously, this weekend, we now have physical security issues that we have to deal with as a sector. We've got decarbonization goals that are incredibly aggressive. I personally would say absolutely necessary, but incredibly aggressive. And then you've got energy equity issues. So there are a range of new realities that are facing Gil and other leaders. And I think at the core of it is a need to rethink everything within your purview, including your communications platform. And so, we've been at the center and found an absolute kindred soul in Karen when we were looking to try to evolve the bipartisan legislation to have it include communications. It's interesting. I think most people took for granted that the bipartisan legislation was actually going to include the grid. I think, when we started working with Karen and the GridWise team, it wasn't an absolute given that infrastructure would include the electric grid. And so I do think we're starting to see a new understanding of the need, the underpinning of broadband and communications for utilities.
And I think, too, the idea that communications were essential to the grid and should be part of that infrastructure was not well understood in the beginning. I mean, for sure, it was a lot of interesting conversations that you helped lead, Chris, with Congress to make them understand, that they needed to put funding into the bill for the communication networks. I was surprised earlier this year when we were putting together our Grid Modernization Index readiness framework. We're not going to rank states anymore like we've done in the past. We're going to put them in kind of buckets. A lot of states didn't appreciate not being in the top 10. But we really want to provide sort of a guide for states thinking about grid modernization. And so we did a workshop with our members, and we were thinking about if we put states into walk, jog, run categories, what is the basic building block of the grid that should be, everybody who's walking should have, and a very small co-op actually said that broadband had to be in that fundamental building block category. So, which surprised me that it was coming from, a small utility with limited resources, but that sort of underpins how critical it's becoming. If you are a utility with existing communication networks, how do you build on that and layer in the advanced communication network?
Yeah. So for those of you who might not be as familiar with ComEd, we're the electric utility that serves the Chicago area, northern Illinois. So think of 100 miles south of Chicago, draw a line, and everything north all the way to Wisconsin and Iowa. About 9 million residents, 70% of the population of Illinois. ComEd probably is one of the first large electric utilities that invested a lot in smart grid technologies over the last 10 years. And from AMI to all the smart grid devices on the grid, and has had a lot of, really produced a lot of value for our customers. I'll give you an example. Calendar year 2021, we were on our benchmarking with similar utilities, we were the #1 in reliability in the United States. And we were voted by PA Consulting as the most resilient utility. A lot of that really is due to the smart grid investments. And one of the things that ComEd has been doing over the past few years is investing in fiber. We're actually layering fiber on top of our distribution system to be able to control the devices that we have put in place. And we're doubling down on that. And I think that in combination with wireless, like private wireless network that Chris is talking about, is probably the right business model for us and utilities going forward. But it is important because there has to be system awareness and visibility, situational awareness and visibility. There needs to be very fast communication and switching of all, those devices need to talk to each other in milliseconds. So if you want to address power quality, for example, a lot of large manufacturers in Illinois, like ADM and others, and a momentary power quality issue can shut down their digital manufacturing equipment, right? It's also a way for us to isolate faults. If there are outages, we can quickly isolate them and keep many other customers up and running. And those are the kind of advantages that you get with having a fast communication system. In the south of Chicago, just about 10-minute drive, there's a neighborhood called Bronzeville. By the way, it's such a cool neighborhood. I come from New York. I'm in Chicago 1 year now, but it's basically, it was the Harlem of the Midwest. It's a lot of famous people, Black culture and commerce really started in Bronzeville. A lot of famous people, Herbie Hancock, Dinah Washington, et cetera, Quincy Jones, they all came from Bronzeville. And ComEd built a first neighborhood scale microgrid in Bronzeville, operating microgrid with solar, battery, and it's enabled by this communication system, fiber. There are synchrophasers that have been installed because you need very fast sampling and time, synchronized, decision making. And we're connecting it to an existing microgrid of Illinois Institute of Technology. So we actually created what we're calling a microgrid cluster controller with Siemens so that we can share resources. It's a Bronzeville community and the IIT campus can share resources just in case something happens to our grid. So there's really a very, it's no longer an option. When we integrate more renewables, when we have more electric charging stations, when we have more heat pumps, hot water heaters that are all going to have devices embedded in them that can communicate with the grid, you need a very robust communication system. Renewables, in the, mostly they're, wind farms and solar farms are located in remote areas. And in our case, Mendota, DeKalb, and we've installed DERMs so that they are not curtailed as much if certain conditions are happening on the grid. And that can only happen, that can only be enabled by communications.
Yeah, I think we all get a sense of why Gil is a thought leader in this area, in this intersection, and has been for quite some time. What we are seeing and starting to recognize is that there's not one reason for a utility to move forward with broadband. We have four large investor-owned utility customers. Each of the four moved forward for a different primary reason. Ultimately, their use cases are going to overlap. As I was at the Wireless Trade Association for about 14 years, and I was there when our wireless devices moved from 2G to 3G. So we got broadband for the first time. And it wasn't until that integration of broadband in the consumer sector that you actually had apps, right? Nobody knew what an app was. And within 2 years, there were hundreds of thousands of apps, right? What we see is as a utility begins to contemplate digitization of their grid and of all of the sensors, they all of a sudden can start to recognize cloud and edge computing, machine learning and artificial intelligence, virtual augmented reality. And with that comes an incredible range of opportunities for the utility, for their customers, for the more rapid integration of distributed and renewable energy. We at Anterix realize that broadband is broadband. Most people understand what it is. But I don't think utilities, except for Gil when he was at NYPA and now at ComEd, I think there were a lot of utilities that didn't understand what that meant. And we launched what we called our ecosystem program. And we now have 90 companies in that ecosystem that are developing solutions for broadband. Many of them are here. What we're seeing is an explosion of interest in developing solutions for utilities that take advantage of the real-time communications. One of the neatest ones we've seen is from Schweitzer Engineering Labs out in Redmond, Washington. they have the ability to de-energize a broken conductor, a broken line before it hits the ground. So you think how that can be a game changer in wildfire mitigation. That capability wasn't usable until it was integrated with high speed, low latency, dedicated broadband, wireless broadband. And now San Diego Gas and Electric has said that that's their primary use case. They're going to deploy it throughout their footprint. And so what we're seeing and recognizing is, Rob, our CEO, calls it, the Swiss Army knife, right? So broadband is a platform, is an underpinning for just about everything that a utility is facing. The need to aggregate and act upon data, the need to be more equitable with your distribution of energy opportunities and offerings. You sort of just can go on with the need to bake in cybersecurity instead of bolting it on to your existing antiquated communication systems. I mean, it's sort of issue after issue, and Gil and Karen have been at the forefront of making policymakers and even other utility executives aware.
So you both have mentioned equity, and one thing that I am concerned about is that that the broadband and a truly digital grid provide, I use the EPB example of benefits beyond just reliable power. In areas where utilities aren't able to make those investments in a digital grid and high, modern communication networks, I worry that when we hear the administration talk about a digital divide, they're talking about internet access. For me, it's bigger than internet access. It's about access to a grid that allows the customer to interact with the grid, that allows it to, a customer to understand their energy use, that allows a customer, should they desire, to put electricity back on, to have their DERs be a resource, especially given FERC Order 2222 creating these emerging markets that if you are not connected to a modern grid, you cannot be part of. So how do we, given the scale of a project to upgrade a utilities communication network, how do we address that equity issue?
At ComEd in Illinois, Illinois passed a law last year called the Climate Equitable Jobs Act, which requires, it's similar to Justice 40, but at the state level. And so at ComEd, the way we're planning the system is think of a Venn diagram. What's best for the system and what's best for disadvantaged and underserved communities, and the intersection of those two circles. That's how we've been prioritizing our investments in the grid and our investment in communication systems. So, for example, we actually identified, the way we deploy our fiber, we identified areas at the census and zip code level of where broadband, in this case, broadband was not adequate. And those were really revealed during the pandemic, when kids were, and all of us were working from home, and kids were doing online classes. And we've been able to identify, as a state and cities in Northern Illinois, which areas were really underserved. So we're trying to prioritize the deployment of our fiber, primarily for our grid. It's primarily for grid operation. But we're finding out that we have excess capacity in that fiber. And so we're leasing the excess capacity to ISPs or telecom providers to provide that last mile. And we've actually applied to some of those installations, we've applied to IIJA funding to kind of accelerate our deployment. But you're right, it's beyond broadband. We want to make sure that our customers have access to all the other clean energy technologies that are getting deployed, whether they're DERs or electric vehicle charging stations, or just really resiliency and reliability. Because most of those zip codes and census tracts where you have disadvantaged communities are also the areas that are most sensitive to the impacts of climate change, whether it's extreme heat or extreme cold. We did a study with the Argonne National Lab. Argonne National Lab in the suburb of Chicago, they have the ability to do a hyper-local climate modeling within a 12-kilometer square mile, a 12 square kilometer area, and they could model what the climate most likely will be in 2030, 2040, 2050. And so we've layered those in our planning process to make sure that we address the issues that you've raised. But it's now part and fully integrated in our planning and investment decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that last sentence is key, I think. The fact that leaders like Gil and ComEd, that it is fully integrated into how they think right now. I was blown away in the early days of the consideration of the bipartisan legislation. I was blown away at the number of utilities and utility executives who brought to our attention the desire to make wireless broadband, which includes fiber when you think of building out towers, wireless broadband infrastructure to communities that were underserved and unserved. Ali, we had conversations like this at NIPA and others, and the idea, and you know, I just keep repeating this because it warms my heart, was that the utilities wanted to do well and to do good, right? They obviously want to do well for their employees and for their customers and for their shareholders, but they also want to do good for their community. And at the heart of that was the middle mile language that ended up in the bipartisan legislation. And you know, Karen and I had a conversation early on about it, and to show you how good the leader of this organization is, I received a call, and she said, she said, I'm sitting in an important senator's office right now. Can you send me that middle mile language, legislation language that you were talking about? And I'm like, sure, I'll get it to you in a moment. And it became the language for middle mile. The genesis of it was direct conversations with utilities who were saying, we're going to build out a wireless network. Ameren is a great example. Ameren is going to build 400 towers within their footprint that they're going to bring fiber to those towers in communities that don't have any broadband access. They're going to bring high-speed wireless equipment. So you don't need to reuse their spectrum or their antennas. But boy, if you drag fiber and electricity to a tower and build that tower and secure the rights of way, it's a game changer for that community from a wireless and fiber-based broadband perspective. And what we're seeing, to Gil's point, is we're seeing utilities bake this concept of energy equity into their thinking from the beginning now. And I think that's spectacular as a citizen to hear that and see that.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of money in the broadband section of the infrastructure bill, and one of the things that we saw as Congress was writing this bill, and it's we talk about convergence here a lot. We saw the need to coordinate across agencies, and particularly with the $7 billion for the electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and then all the money that the DOE had for the grid side of things. I was a little, I had to remind Maria about Commerce, because there is a lot of money at Commerce, and maybe you want to spend a little bit more time talking about that money, because it is in a department that is not usually a place where this industry would look to for that federal funding to help build out your modern grid.
I'm going to sound like a broken record a little bit, but Karen, again, so
that's not why I'm asking.
Yeah, exactly. Set it up and I'll hit it back. So the Department of Commerce, NTIA, has tens and tens of billions of dollars to try to solve the digital divide from a broadband perspective. Karen and the GridWise team were integral in ensuring there was language in that made sure that utilities were not prohibited from securing some of those funds, right? So I think more often than not, our investor-owned utility community will not get into the provision of broadband directly to consumers. That doesn't mean some won't, but most probably won't. But our co-op community very much is interested in having a broad suite of product services to their consumers, which at times will include broadband. And so, NTIA, and it's going to flow through the states, but it is tens and tens of billions.
$42.5 billion.
Yeah, 42.5.
In addition to the $1 billion that's at Commerce specifically for utilities.
Right, so there's $1 billion specifically for middle mile, and it specifically calls out utilities. And then, they were both excited, they being, a couple of the key offices, again, on the Democratic side in the Senate, were excited about the middle mile language, but not super excited that it was reduced to $1 billion. So there's a second bill that's under consideration that would amp up and increase significantly middle mile funding, again, designed to really use every tool in the toolbox to address this digital divide, this broadband gap. And, as someone who's spent 20 plus years sort of working on trying to close that gap, we do need more tools. And utilities have a different mandate, they have a different mission, right? They serve, they deliver, Gil's team delivers electricity to areas that have absolutely no broadband, right? And so they do hit geography that would never be hit by a wireless or fiber broadband company, but for some form of subsidy like this, or a tool like a utility putting in their own broadband connectivity. And so I am happy that we're moving in the right direction. There is a lot of money. I think we need to hold Maria and the team and the secretary to the notion that the funding has to go to things that are transformative. I think it's possible that we'll see money going to projects that might not be transformative, which is okay, but there certainly should also be a focus on ensuring that the tens and tens of billions go to transformative projects that make those communities stronger, safer, better, more advanced.
So I always say that what looks transformative for one utility will look different for another utility based on the geography, the customer base, the legacy of investment. But is there a way for utilities? We've got some utilities that don't even have SCADA systems yet. Is there a way to jump over the kind of steps of some technologies that we consider foundational with advanced communications?
I think so. Even a big utility like ours, we still have wireline communication systems and 900 megahertz radios, right? And those kind of technology while we're evolving to broadband, whether it's fiber or private LTE. But the good thing now with all this monies from the federal government that you could, bypass this kind of older technology and go straight to broadband technologies. And I think that's the opportunity, either on their own for the smaller utilities, get some money from Commerce and DOE, or communities that can lease excess capacity from a big utility like ours. I think that's the exciting opportunity. And if I can just also pivot, you mentioned about cyber and physical security. We do need to think a lot about that right from the beginning. We're going to increase the threat surface just because there are going to be a lot more, devices out there, both in the customer side, behind the meter, and on the grid side. Improvement in power electronics, sensors, material science will increase the amount of devices, 5G, right? All of that. And so we need to really think about, third-party risk, if you're a utility, because you rely on technology providers to give you those technologies. And just what happened this weekend in Duke, their substation. High speed and broadband is very important. ComEd, we've invested over $700 million in hardening our substations over the last 10 years. And it includes sophisticated cameras, reflected gravel and lighting systems and sensors, et cetera, that can hopefully be a deterrent. But if something happens, you can actually see and have a recording of what actually happens. And I think that's going to be standard for utilities going forward, after Metcalf and after what happened this weekend. in the Duke service territory. So it's very important to keep in mind the security of the electric grid, and a robust telecom system is a must to have both a robust cyber, which will provide you with real-time situational awareness and visibility of the grid, but also on physical security. Because same thing, if you want, monitoring 24/7 with sensors, et cetera, recording, you need to have a robust communication system.
Yeah.
And it does seem counterintuitive that as you create more connectivity across your system, that perhaps you have the opportunity to improve your cyber posture. So Chris, maybe you could speak a little bit more on that.
So one of the folks on our team, one of my consultants is the former chief technology officer of the Department of Energy, and I stole this from him. If you can begin with a greenfield communications build, you get to bake in your security parameters instead of trying to bolt them on after the fact. And so, beginning with a private network, you can detach it from the public internet. You get to have the inherent cyber and evolving communications security parameters of LTE, but then you get to layer in your own security desires. We're working with 7 distinct cybersecurity companies, and their goal is to provide utilities with the opportunity to layer in belt and suspenders from a cybersecurity perspective. The key is to give, Gil and his team and others the real-time situational awareness and operational intelligence, so that they can make decisions, and reclosers can kick in, and sensors can be acted upon. We're also, Karen, to your earlier question, we're doing a lot of work with the labs as well. So we've had a couple different projects with NREL, including both with NREL and with EPRI, cybersecurity submissions to the Department of Energy to look at sort of an integrated, robust, and secure communications platform. And then on a broader scale, we're working with EPRI to really put together an education campaign so that we can accelerate the learning opportunities for utilities, to come up with a half dozen or so educational modules that utilities would have to go through as they contemplate broadband, and sort of give utilities a chance to learn from each other and move forward quickly.
And how are you seeing your customers integrate their data systems? Since that's one of the things that we talk about is all the time are these silos of data across the utility. And Gil, you may have some thoughts too on how you bring all those data streams together, because we know we need to, but there's a lot of legacy systems.
Yeah, so Ameren is a great example. They've said this publicly. They will sunset 22 disparate, purpose-built wireless networks within their footprint and integrate all of that onto one broadband system. So you go from a dripping data faucet to a data lake, and you have the ability to integrate internally. And then ultimately, we've talked at length about the idea of a network of networks, the ability to, with security obviously, but to integrate the data that's coming into a utility with some of its neighbors. Think of the benefits from a mutual aid perspective. If you knew what was happening, brownout or something similar in a neighboring utility, or a cyber attack, and you knew about it in real time because you were able to harness and analyze and act upon data. So, obviously you have to, when you're talking about that much data, and Gil is right, we just completed a study that said there'll be close to 300 million utility endpoints within the next 10 years within their network. And so there are more points of presence, and the threat vector is going to change and evolve. But if you build that in from the beginning, you can actually capture the data from those 300 million endpoints, and it can change your awareness of your own operations in real time.
Is that one utility having 300 million or 300?
No, that's across the footprint.
That seems low, actually.
Yeah, well, and so as we saw on the wireless side, it'll go up like this, and then there's going to be a change, and it's going to take off. I mean, pulling some of those endpoints that were attached to narrowband sort of non-broadband networks, and as the end of life cycle hits, moving them on to broadband networks. You'll see that number continue to increase, more than arithmetically.
And utilities usually think of the demarcation line as the meter, right? When in reality, customers' devices, whether it's a home or a commercial building or industrial customers, are going to have intelligence built into those devices or the systems that they have. And really, utilities have to think about this notion, and EPRI called it the shared integrated grid. It's really beyond the meter. And how do we integrate those devices, those customer systems, and DERs as part of the grid? So we basically have to move the demarcation line all the way into the customer, all the way into the DERs. And that's sort of the notion of Order 222, right, at FERC, that proceeding. It's evolving to that. So utilities have to kind of rethink if we do that, if we actually move the demarcation line all the way into customer devices, mechanical, electrical systems, talk about the amount of data, right? And, it will be exponential from what we have today.
Well, you mentioned FERC Order 2222, and some of you know that we're working on another paper on the grid investments that are needed to support FERC Order 2222. Really from a distribution perspective, as I mentioned about digital equity, what does a distribution utility need to do to make sure that its customers can then be part of this market? But if you get a utility like ComEd fully integrated with broadband, how then do you communicate with the bulk power system? There's another layer of communication there?
Well, that's a debate for another conference, right? With all people making comments at FERC. But you're right, if there is indeed eventually a DSO, right, a distribution system operator, is that going to be, who owns it, who runs it? But that's the theoretical vision, right, from where we are today all the way to having sort of like a DSO. How is that going to work? I don't know. I think a lot of people that evolution will happen over time.
Yeah, I'm with Gil. I'm excited, but it will be disconcerting at times as you envision this future. But to me, it's the holy grail is sort of a integrated web of the grid on the transmission and distribution side, and a complete and total understanding as we integrate non-utility owned distributed energy, and how does that play in? So it's complex, but it is the future.
I think the key is, we always need to put the customer at the center when we make these decisions. When we think about providing comments to FERC, we always begin with the customer. What's the value to the customer? And then work from there. And I think if we all do that in a collaborative way, I think we will evolve along the right path.
So I have one last question before I open it up to the audience. What are you seeing, and Chris, you're kind of looking across the country at what are the barriers to broader deployment of broadband?
Yeah, I mean, Karen, it's a great question. I think, again, I'm next to a well-known thought leader of a major utility, and I can't imagine the issues that are on his desk on a daily basis, not to mention the wild cards that get thrown in when a storm comes in. We did our last board meeting, GridWise board meeting in Chicago, and we showed up at the baseball stadium, and pretty much the world was going to end. It got like that weird shade of green outside, and there was a siren going off, and I was pretty sure we were under attack by some, and the next morning, Gil's out in the field trying to restore power, right? So I do think making sure that we and utilities find time to focus on the importance and the underpinning of broadband for so much of what they do. but really finding space in a utility CEO's calendar and brain to really focus on it is probably key. And then recognizing that with all of these new realities, utility executives are going to have to rethink everything, right? Yeah. So there are some investments that have been made in the last 5 years that are, that probably, aren't going to be your future communications platform. And so recognizing that, you have to plan for broadband. I mean, I think Anterix is well situated to be the wireless solution, but broadband is coming to utilities, whether or not my company, wins the commercial battles. Wireless, fiber-based. Gil talked about the hundreds of millions of dollars that are being spent within utilities for fiber. And an absolute component of that is going to be wireless broadband as well. So it's coming. And when you hear the director say, targets in the 30s for carbon, neutral or carbon zero, that means everything has to be, deployed quickly.
Yeah. And major challenge really is competing priorities for investments, from a utilities perspective. So it's important that we all work together and really highlight the use cases, and share the use cases where when we deploy broadband and the associated use cases, if and when they provide significant value to our customers, we should really communicate those and share those amongst each other, because eventually we need to explain all of this to our regulators or to our boards if you're a public power or a co-op system. And you need to get approvals for this kind of investments. So for a utility, we need to invest in core investment, just replace aging equipment, move stuff because the local government or the state government need to do their public works project. We call them facility relocations. You have to just invest in reliability. You have to invest, that's first, I call that core. And then you have to invest in clean. You got to integrate renewables, batteries, EV charging stations, et cetera. And then resiliency to address more severe and more frequent, events, weather events. So it's core, it's clean, and resiliency investments. What's going to underpin all of those is a robust communication system, but explaining that how that supports those three buckets of investment is not easy, because it's not always apparent what's the benefit to consumers, especially now in an inflationary environment when there's a run-up in energy costs, both capacity and energy, and everything else is expensive, labor and material. There's you can only invest so much before causing a bill impact that's not acceptable, right? So how do you balance that? There's an art and a science to it.
Yeah. Thank you, Gil. So let me open it up for questions. I see Clint.
Really more of a compliment and quick comment than a question, but I remember attending a conference on the future of the grid just before COVID, and someone asked the panel what they were doing with respect to using communications to modernize the grid, and the utility panelists very candidly said, well, we haven't really focused on that for this discussion. So it's really great to see the opening panel of your conference today, realizing just how critical an issue this is. And I think Gil's point, there are so many use cases for what we're talking about, but cyber, as we move toward 5G and so many other really increased threats to the platform, when we start seeing the possibility of private LTE networks for utilities, gives me hope that we really can modernize quickly enough to protect, as well as deal with some of the issues you've each mentioned. Also, Karen, to hear you talk about not just the critical problem of broadband from an internet perspective. Some cities have 20 and 30% of the community that doesn't have access to the internet. But then you take it a step beyond and look at distributed energy resources and clean tech and all the other issues that people are not going to be able to take advantage of. I'm just really impressed and grateful that you're covering these points today.
Thanks, Glenn. There's yeah.
Dan Pfeiffer with Itron. Gil, question for you. You mentioned leasing dark fiber. I was wondering, one, was that a regulated asset? And if it is, how did the commission treat that revenue? You know, one of our challenges with the smart networks that we've sold you guys is, we're trying to sell the multi-purpose, multi-use aspects. Why have 12 separate networks over a smart city? Why not have one and leverage it? But we start to mix taxpayer money, ratepayer money, involve entities that the commission doesn't regulate and can't just say do it. So I'm curious how you guys are dealing with that on your fiber.
Well, in our jurisdiction, it's part of our rate base. And so if we get additional revenue, say from a third party, whether it's ISP or a telecom provider, it's going to reduce our revenue requirement, basically. So that's the structure that we have. With IIJA, hopefully that reduces the total cost and we can deploy more. So that's how we're looking at it in our jurisdiction. Interestingly, also at ComEd, we've installed AMI, as you well know, and the other thing we're doing now is, and we're an electric-only utility, but we just signed an agreement with People's Gas, and it was Chicago and the northern suburbs of Chicago to read all their gas meters, and then they pay us, and then again that reduces our revenue requirement for the benefit of our customers. So we're trying to really leverage what we have, not just for our own purpose, but either for another utility or for the community.
And I think that's one, it is state by state. And I mean, you can speak to this more than I can, but I know that in Nevada, the largest co-op there, wanted to provide broadband, but was not allowed to actually sell broadband to the customer. So they spun out a separate entity that actually does the utility provides the broadband access, and then their separate entity actually sells it to the customer.
And our goal has been at sort of the macro level just to educate NARUC, sort of the convening organizations to, if you really do want to tackle this problem, you got to remove some of these barriers, right? You've got to create an environment where ComEd can take an asset that they're already going to deploy, and it's incrementally more expensive to add additional capacity, additional strands of fiber, and if you can make those available, you can help close that digital divide. But we do need regulators that are willing to think and be more forward thinking.
And in our case, we're not looking to enter the telecom business or the broadband, ISP business. It's strictly leasing excess capacity to a third party. Yeah.
There's a question over here. Josh, can you see?
I just want to note while it's going over there, there's on the left and right-hand sides in here, there's about 50 people signed up, but you can also enter questions if you don't feel like speaking them. The sign-in and the access code is there. If you can't see it, feel free to get it during break.
And then Richie will ask the questions.
Yeah,
if
they come to me.
If you're online watching and you have a question, you can send it in and we'll address it.
And we'll get to one in just 1 second. But Josh, you want to go over there?
Thank you very much. I had a question because we've been talking about IoT, we've been talking about communications, we've been talking about data. Aren't we really already a telecom? And okay, that being said, maybe not regulated, maybe not in true sense business model, but all the components are there. So my question is, how is IoT and cloud computing going to affect your business models going forward?
Well, as I've said, there are going to be a lot more IoT devices out there, not just on the grid, but beyond the meter, inside customers' premises, and with 5G. And I mean, I just see that demarcation line getting pushed out into the customer. And there's going to be a lot of sharing of resources. We did a study to model the Climate Equitable Jobs Act that our state passed last year, and also to reach the U.S. Climate Alliance goal of net zero by 2050 for the state of Illinois. It was interesting because it will double our peak, at least our peak electric demand. And instead of happening in July or August, it would happen in February between 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. in the morning, right? So it's the grid is going to fundamentally change. So think of EVs, think of heat pumps for space heating and hot water heating. If they really get ramped up and deployed, what's going to happen to our grid, capacities of our transformers and substations and all the required IoT devices to have system visibility, monitoring, et cetera, orchestrating all of the IoT devices. It's going to be interesting to watch over the course of, maybe the next decade or so.
Yeah, I had this little light bulb moment of when you have utilities who've made their own, decarbonization commitments. You have states. You have the administration. To me, one of the most interesting elements is we're asking utilities to commit and drive a decarbonized future. Part of that, it's become circular. Part of that is the electrification of other sectors, which puts greater pressure on the utility, right? So if getting to our decarbonization goals involves the complete electrification of our vehicle fleet, the stress, the pressure that puts on GIL and ComEd and other utilities, and when you put it into the greater sort of fleet transportation, and you put it into building and renewable, and all of a sudden it becomes this circular compounding of the difficulty of getting there. We do see that cloud and edge computing and machine learning are going to be game changers. It's something that's in most of our lives. It's just not aggressively deployed within utilities. But with all the fiber that's being deployed and the movement towards advanced wireless broadband, you're going to see and it won't be incremental, right? It'll be sort of a geometric rise in that evolution. And utilities already operate private communications networks, right? This isn't a huge transformation, right? Gil's team has probably dozens of wireless networks within their footprint. And it's just recognizing the value of broadband and the evolution to broadband.
Got a question over here. Behind you, Richie. Oh, one more. Okay. So 3 more, at least. Yeah.
Steve Kona with VIA. Question for Gil in terms of new things on the grid. You're the only utility in the U.S. that's operating a superconductor. I wonder if you might say a few things about how that works with your system and your experience with it.
Yeah. So we're the only utility with a superconductor system that we're piloting. But it's operating. It basically connects 2 substations in the northwest portion of the city of Chicago, serving over, I would say, between 100 to 200,000 customers. And it makes it more reliable. So it operates uses nitrogen to cool it. But basically, one superconductor cable, probably this big, replaced about 13 or 14 of the normal cables. That if we were to connect those 2 substations with standard cables, it would take 12 or 13 of the normal size cable, and it's just one basically. And So hopefully there will be applications. There's a lot of cooling required, et cetera, and we even put a splice and a curve to it so we could see the characteristic if you need to have some bending. So if you have a chance, so more than happy to give you a tour. The people who installed them, they're very proud of that installation. And it is the first of its kind. It's the only one in the United States, supported by DOE and DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and American Superconductor.
So the superconductor people used to come visit me when I worked in the speaker's office, and they used to give me little, what I called energy tchotchkes. And I mean, it's fascinating, what it looks like, but you don't want to have it in your carry-on luggage going through TSA. So trying to explain that. Yep.
Perfect. All right. I appreciate the conversation this morning. Mark Thompson, I'm with National Grid. I'm responsible for grid mod in upstate New York, so this hits near and dear to me. Also went through a crash course last 9 months submitting two middle mile proposals. One thing that's really obvious to me, or really been interesting to me over the last few months, trying to pull together these broadband proposals or middle mile proposals, is the integrated planning aspect of telecommunications infrastructure. So you mentioned, Gil, how this is a big part of everything we do, and I agree. We are pipes and wires and data company, really, as we evolve. So any insights in how communication infrastructure can be integrated into planning efforts, especially as it supports not just transmission, but distribution, enterprise, maybe gas networks, the whole gamut, and looking at long-term planning of these assets?
In our case, it happened organically. There was a decision in our case when we start making investments in smart grid, 5-10 years ago now. There was a decision to really put fiber on top of that. And organically, and after putting smart meters, also AMI system, organic. Now we're reading gas meters. We're starting to read, by the way, also I forgot to mention, water companies. So we're starting to read, meters of water companies in Northern Illinois using our AMI system network. Again, it lowers our revenue requirement. It's cheaper for people's gas and the water companies to just hop onto our network. So yes. We need to have that planning. On the climate side, when I was at the New York Power Authority, we actually did a study with Argonne on resiliency, and we did it with AT&T. So NYPA and AT&T partnered together to look at what are the impacts of climate to not just the power system, but the telecom system. Because there are interdependencies, as you know, so upstate New York especially, right? You get 7 feet of snow there just recently. So that it's starting to happen. And, I know it's some of the NYPA folks are Justin Driscoll, the head of NYPA in the back there, and Ali Muhammad is here, can talk to you about the resiliency study that they did. NYPA did with Argonne and AT&T. Very, very interesting. Probably is the first of its kind where telecom and utility did it together.
And we're seeing some of the leading service providers, the Black & Veatch, Burns McDonnell, West Monroe, other companies like that, really, to Gil's point, sort of organically sitting down with utilities and saying, you have assets, within your footprint, and if you're going to touch a pole, let's contemplate putting a wireless tower on top of that pole, transmission, distribution, and so we're seeing utilities really begin to integrate it into their broader thinking about the electric elements of their grid, integrating the communications considerations as well.
I think we have time for one more.
Steve.
Thank you. Gil, I wanted to go back to Bronzeville for just a minute. And that it's clearly a 5-star example of what utilities can do with local community development, both from an infrastructure standpoint as well as jobs and other things. So hats off on that. But I wanted to get your thoughts on how that's going to be replicated either in other parts of your territory or other utilities that might use that as an example. Bronzeville's been around a long time.
Yeah.
And we don't want to wait 10 years for the next Bronzeville to happen. So
Yep.
do you guys have specific plans for
Yes.
deploying
So
systems
we
like that?
are, not yet announced, but we have a couple of other neighborhoods outside Chicago, one in Chicago and one outside Chicago to replicate what we call community of the future. And we really designed Bronzeville so that it can be replicable. And that was one of the design criteria for DOE anyway, DOE funding. More to come. And we're learning a lot, Steve. We're learning a lot how to do it more cost effectively, how to integrate. Once you build the microgrid, the microgrid is going to be fully operational in June, July of next year. And it's an entire neighborhood. It's meshed with, the neighboring university, Illinois Institute of Technology. They have their own microgrid, and we basically can share each other with this cluster microgrid controller that Siemens and ComEd built. It was designed so that it could be replicable, and we're looking at to other areas. And it's open. We want to share our findings, and we want to invite people to look at it so that it can be tested in other jurisdictions as well. And it has a very unique regulatory framework and construct also. So for utilities, I think that's probably one of the most interesting things. How did our regulators agree for us to build it in such a way? How are the costs recovered? What parts can we earn? What parts we can't earn, et cetera? What parts we can participate and not participate? So for example, we can't participate as a generator, right? We're a pure T&D, so that's one of the construct that was pre-agreed. But there were other unique regulatory design schemes that were integrated for that to happen.
Well, join me in thanking Gil and Chris.
Can I just say one last thing?
You may.
Chairman's
Chair's
prerogative. You've heard, and I think Chris mentioned a lot, how GridWise really influenced the language, the final language that were in paragraphs that were eventually integrated in the IIJA, especially the IIJA, some in the IRA, but let me talk about the IIJA. And so if your company is on the fence or is still not a member of GridWise, now you should really consider it, because now the next phase that GridWise is involved in, I think you all ought to be engaged in, you heard Maria this morning, is in the writing of the regulations and the guidelines coming out of the legislation. So if you want to have a seat at the table to help influence the regs and the guidelines, not just at DOE, Commerce, Department of Transportation, all these other federal agencies that are going to be doling out the dollars, GridWise is the place to be. GridWise is at the center of that conversation happening right now. So I mean, Karen and Team Richie do a great job, and it's been fascinating for me being the chair of GridWise now for about 2-3 years, right? On how we punch way above our weight.
Yes.
And we want you to join us and be part of that journey going forward to really accelerate this energy transition.
I did not tee them up to do this.
Yeah, that's awesome.
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 Thank you very much.
All right.
Richie.
Thank you.